So I wanted to start this video off by saying no, I don't think triple DPS is going to be the only meta, or the meta that can just completely dominates over all other metas. However, I feel like currently, the way that the game's been kind of changing, it is going to be a pretty strong meta that you can play, along with dive comp and along with somewhat spam comp, and I guess also somewhat quad tank. They all work decently well in the meta right now as far as Overwatch competitive solo queue works, and I guess we're kind of going to have to wait until we see more of how the Overwatch League works with a lot of the changes to see if they pick up more of this. But as far as, again, competitive goes, I personally believe that yes, the triple DPS meta is going to be quite a bit better and already has been showing up quite a bit in a lot of my games. Now, I also do want to say that triple DPS is somewhat awkward to play, and it mainly does focus on getting out more frags than the enemies. If your team doesn't have a lot of DPS players, you should not go triple DPS. I think that should be pretty dang obvious. But if you have 4 DPS players, maybe you could try it. Go triple DPS, play with a Reinhardt or an Orisa or Winston, depending on, kind of what DPS you have, and see what works out. Because honestly, people showing off their skills with the DPS oftentimes is better than them just picking up a tank that they aren't that great with. With that out of the mind though, I kind of want to talk about the triple DPS meta itself and I guess competitive. And I'm going to say right now that I don't think that it's going to be the very best at the top elo. And by that I really mean the Overwatch League, where there's really good teams put together that have great dives with all their dive tanks, that know how to protect their supports and all that with the tanks. But I think in competitive, where it's again a lot more about frags and about getting picks, that's where it's kind of going to shine, and that's where it's already been shining for a decent amount of time. I mean, if you look at the top of the ladder, there's triple DPS in just about every single game. Probably because there's a lot of people one-tricking to be, get up there. But either way, it does work, and it has been working at least for a while. Now, a reason why I think that this meta is going to be actually kind of viable right now is that there just aren't way too many huge counters against it. And I guess by counters, in most cases, I'm really talking about tanks. When there's a lot of tanks that are very good, it's kind of hard for certain DPS to, I guess, outdamage the tanks, outlast the tanks, and really do way too much. However, with a lot of the tanks being nerfed recently, and without way too many other tanks getting buffed up, it really has been a decent time to pick up DPS. As well, with a lot of new maps that are very open, many of the DPS have just benefited from that alone. So that could be another thing that I guess doesn't affect every single game, but does affect a decent amount of games. And I guess we can't forget to mention the fact that Reaper and Mei both are getting buffed, which both again do kind of hurt tanks. I don't think that's the main reason why triple DPS is showing up, but I guess you could add that to one of the partial reasons why it's showing up. Now, back to triple DPS itself, I'm going to say that if you were good enough to play triple DPS in the past, you almost always could. And again, going to a top 500 example, in a lot of those games, when you watch VODs or watch reviews or really whatever, there's a lot of triple DPS. Unless they're losing, then they kind of switch it up. But just at the beginning, there's a lot of DPS because there's a lot of players that are extremely good at those characters. And they know that if they play well enough, they will kind of be able to make up for the lack of a real great team comp and instead kind of use their own personal skill to get picks, to push the enemy back, to stall for time, all of that together. People have kind of always been able to do that. I just think now it's easier for the masses, I guess, to do that than in the past. Because in the past, I think you had to be a lot more skilled than the average person in your rank to kind of go for triple DPS. While right now, I think you can just be at about the same skill as everyone else in your rank and still do pretty well with it, even if you aren't a god. Now, another thing I should say right here is that not all DPS are going to benefit that much from triple DPS, and there's actually a decent amount of DPS that actually kind of get hurt from other DPS. A few examples right here I think are Reaper, Doomfist, and Farah, and I know that this can be situational, especially depending on what DPS the enemy team plays, but I think against Doomfist, there's just a lot of DPS that actually counter him pretty well, a lot of DPS that can snipe him, a lot of DPS that can force him back, and even if he dives your backline, well, if you have a McCree or Hanzo that plays really well, that can be kind of hard for him. Reaper, I think, is a much better example, though, where he is really good at taking out tanks and can flank, but in a lot of cases, he is more for taking out those tanks, for putting out a lot of pressure in the front line. But if the enemy team doesn't really have a front line and instead are just shooting Hanzo arrows, shooting Widow shots, trying to punch you as Doomfist, it's kind of difficult to do way too much as him. So Reaper kind of shoves out a lot of tanks from the meta, which hurts him, in fact. a little awkward, at least from what I'm seeing with Reaper, but it is kind of how it goes. And finally with Farah, I mean, if you have more McCrees, if you have more soldiers, more Widowmakers, it's just kind of harder to play her, especially since a lot of the times, I mean, D.Va's great against Farah, but a lot of the times people wouldn't pick D.Va as a tank player because you just don't really like her. So, I mean, if you're playing Zarya against Farah, or Hog against Farah, or Orisa against Farah, you can't do way too much. And I think, yeah, having more DPS on DPS could kind of hurt some of those characters, and a few other characters that I don't really want to mention right here. In general, I'm just going to say for this, if your DPS focuses on getting kills on tanks, they're going to be kind of awkward. And if they focus on really using just good sight lines, or if they really just have another DPS that can go on the enemy team that can counter them pretty well, it's kind of awkward to play them. But I'm going to say that for a lot of these DPS that might be a little awkward to play, you still can play them as a protection for your supports. I mean, a really good example is Doomfist, where he's not the best protection, but he can hit people off of his supports, save their lives quite a few times, and yeah, get damage boosted, do whatever he needs to. And Reaper's another good idea, where you can just stand right next to your supports and just kind of scare the enemy DPS away from them. And hopefully your supports will last longer than the enemies, and you might be able to win from that alone. Of course, it does kind of depend on if your teammate's DPS are better than the enemy teams, but still, you're at least contributing quite a bit to your team because you are keeping your supports alive. I guess that's another thing about the triple DPS meta that you might want to kind of keep in mind, depending on your DPS. Now, switching to something else, the supports in the game right now, I think a lot of the supports just overall in Overwatch work great with DPS. Right now we have Lucio Zenyatta. Zenyatta is just great at getting picks, does a ton of damage, and can really help flankers. That's pretty obvious. And Lucio can help people like Reaper or Mei or whatever, any of the slower characters without mobility, help them kind of catch up to the characters with mobility. I mean, if they don't have a Lucio as well, and that can also be a good way, I guess, to kind of beat that out. Now, even if you look at Mercy and Moira, they can still work pretty good with a few, and especially if your own DPS don't deathball, but if they do play pretty close to each other, well, Moira can heal them a lot better than any of the other supports, so you can sometimes just out-heal the enemies, and as well with Mercy, she is very mobile, she can get a lot of healing, compared, I guess, to Lucio and Zenyatta again. And while I don't think that in a lot of cases they're quite as good, they still can work. Now, Ana is kind of dead in the water in triple DPS. I mean, she does have a nice ultimate, and sometimes you could, you know, maybe argue playing her because she can heal from really far away when DPS are really in the enemy backline. But I think in a lot of cases, Ana's just kind of hard to stay alive with. I guess you could kind of say a similar thing to Zen, but I think Zen is just so powerful on your team with DPS, while Ana is just kind of a average or below average pick that really struggles against enemy flankers, unless you're a super good Ana, which, let's be honest, not every single person is, because she's very difficult to play. And there we go with supports. I guess before we finish, I have a few other things to mention. First off, right here, if you are playing triple DPS but your team is losing, please switch off of it. If your team is just not doing any good at all, you're not getting any frags, it's just like you need more defenses, obviously switch to 2-2-2. And sometimes even with even with a 3 DPS main loadout on your team, I guess, if you want to call it that, or just a team with 3 DPSs as their main role, you still might want to switch to 2-2-2. That's fine. As well, sometimes you might even want to switch to triple tank or quad tank because it can kind of throw off the enemies, and then you could switch back to triple DPS later. Just kind of remember that, yeah, you still can change your role in this game, and just because you're starting off with triple DPS because you want to try it out and see if it works, doesn't mean that you have to play it the entire time. And finally, I want to mention again that I don't think this meta is going to be completely dominant at all, like the tank meta, or like the Mercy meta, or any of that stuff. I think it's just going to be a viable meta to run right now. So again, I'm not saying, you know, you have to play this meta every single game, and if you don't play triple DPS, you're pretty much screwed. That's not really how it is. I think you still can play a decent Reinhardt and, you know, maybe Zarya, and if the enemies aren't great at getting frags, that can actually work okay. You have a lot of point presence. You can also still play dive comp with D.Va and Winston, and again, if the enemies can't frag your supports really quickly, well, Winston and D.Va can do a lot still. Even though D.Va was nerfed a decent amount, she still can do a lot. And even spam comp, well, if your spam comp is staying alive long enough, they can still sometimes out-frag a DPS or triple DPS comp, kind of depending on the game. Do realize that there are a lot of viable metas right now, and that this is just going to be one additional one that I guess you can add onto the top, which might be kind of useful to keep in mind, seeing as there are so many DPS players. It seems like more are showing up every single day, and I think this is, I guess, a thing to keep in mind, and really just not get angry at your team if they are going triple DPS. It still is a fine thing to do. And I guess the very final thing I want to say is that when Brigitte comes out, I think she'll also work pretty good with this comp, because she's kind of like Lucio, can get in there, can heal them all at the same time, can provide some crowd control, which the DPS can't really provide, and gives all of them armor, which lets them flank and one-clip people a little bit easier and a little bit safer, as well with her ultimate and with her shift. So that might also be a nice thing. I guess we're just going to kind of have to wait for that, though. Anyways, as always, guys, though, thank you all for watching. Hope you guys enjoyed. This has just been what I am personally seeing in a lot of my games, what I've been seeing in a lot of the games that I've been reviewing for VODs. But if you have your own different experiences, please leave those down in the comment section down below. And if you're a tank main, please keep in mind, yes, you still can play 2 tanks or 3 tanks. You won't be completely screwed. It still is a viable option. You just kind of have to think about how are we going to really just counteract all these DPS and stop them from doing their job, because if you can do that, well, you're still going to be very useful to your team. And I think even people like D.Va, who did get pretty good nerfs, are still going to be useful if you can play them right. With all that said, though, guys, thank you all for watching. Hope you enjoyed. If you did, make sure to leave a like, or again, comment down below your own opinion. And as always, guys, though, have a wonderful day.